that's it. Daniel Dubov, the winner of the Lindores Abbey Rapid Challenge after that absolutely epic and spectacular final. I'm mind blown by everything that's happened.
Yeah, that was quite something to watch. There were so many things that happened today.
All right, hello everyone, and welcome to the final after show for the Lindores Abbey Rapid Challenge. The tournament concluded today, as you just saw in that last little video. That was the reaction on camera live of Daniel Dubov after he won in Armageddon with the white pieces in what was a really crazy final, a very exciting final. Went all the way to Armageddon. In a way, it's great when it goes to Armageddon. In a way, it's a shame that it ends with such a game that feels a little bit more random. But the action today did not disappoint. I did want to speak a little bit to start about the chess in Scotland. That is our final heritage chess, the hashtag heritage chess that we created for this event. In collaboration with our sponsor, the Lindores Abbey Preservation Society. Chess in Scotland is directly related to them. The abbey in question is a monastery that the abbey itself was built in the early, I think it was 1100s. And so you can read more about that. But this story is really about chess in Scotland itself, which has a long and storied past, dating all the way back to one of the oldest chess clubs in the world, as you can read here, as well as a lot of very famous tournaments. In particular, for example, in Edinburgh, there's also the Glasgow, I believe it's pronounced, chess club. My Scottish pronunciation is always a little bit off, but if you are a fan of history and chess, this article is definitely a great read. I encourage you to read it. Now, let's take a look at today's results. So as you can see here, Dubov won 3-2 thanks to his victory in the Armageddon game. He did score first in the second game. We'll look at that with black, but then he lost with white in the following game. And so we'll go through this, but black was definitely doing fairly well in this match, usually scoring the first victory. I believe in every match, black scored the first victory. And I think black overall probably scored better than white in this particular match. So pretty surprising. But for Dubov, let's take a look here at his path here. He spoke in the interview after about his first match that you can see at the bottom here against Sergei Karyakin, where he played really inspired chess and managed to beat someone who's very, very solid, knows his openings really well. This was sort of the battle between the theoreticians. And then he made it look reasonably easy against Ding Liren on his way to the final against Hikaru. And with Hikaru, as you know, was a very tough match, but he came out on top. Well-deserved winner. He did speak a little bit at the end, sort of tongue-in-cheek about how the real winner of the tournament is always the person who beats Magnus. And in that case, that was Hikaru, who did, on the way to the final, beat Levon Arignan quite convincingly, and then had this crazy match against Magnus that he ended up winning. But really, it was an amazing tournament. Some great matches. As you can see, many of them went the distance to the third set or third match, as it did today. And for Daniel Dubov, this is certainly a big win. He's someone who's had success in rapid chess before, but this is definitely a big win in this event. He wins the $45,000 large first prize. Which is pretty awesome for an online chess tournament. We haven't seen this kind of prizes, before. So let's go through today's through the chess of today. It was definitely an interesting match. In the first game ended in a draw, and it was interesting to see whether Daniel would try to repeat the opening from yesterday, where he got good positions, and he did. So he played c4, and they repeat this line, the 4 knights with g3, that Hikaru has been faithfully defending in this tournament. Hikaru plays d5, So they actually repeat all of this. I'm going through it quickly because it is exactly what they played twice in the last match. But we will get to the point where they deviate. So I explained this in a little bit more detail in the previous match. But here, after bishop takes f3, in one game Hikaru played rook b8. In another game he played queen c8. So those are all moves that defend the b7 pawn. Now today he plays c6. And interestingly, c6, which clearly was a bit of preparation from Hikaru here, c6 was played by black in a game between where black was this Armenian grandmaster named Armen Pashikian, and white was none other, of course, than Daniel Dubov. So Dubov could not have been too surprised here by this choice. That being said, it seems to be a reasonable attempt for black to equalize. It's a pawn sacrifice, right? This pawn can be taken, but in exchange for the pawn, we'll see what white gets. And he does take it here. B takes e6, you know, sort of the move here. Now, in the aforementioned game between Dubov and Pashikian, Dubov had played d4. So it's interesting to see the depth of preparation of these guys, of course, is kind of staggering. But in that game, I can just show you a few of the moves. They get this structure, so each side has an isolated pawn here that's somewhat weak. But Pashikian did manage to get a solid position here, and Dubov didn't get too much in this game. You know, the game ended with a win for Dubov, but it didn't look like he got too much out of the opening. So with that in mind, he played bishop takes e6. The final move here, that there might be other moves that are interesting. Like you could try something like queen c2. Say, you know what, I would rather keep this pawn to take later rather than waste time, and just play maybe queen c2 followed by rook d1 or maybe d3, and just play more positionally. And you know, that could be something to try. You can also try to play a4, a5 sometimes. So queen c2 is a move that might be interesting. You know, prevents bishop f5, bishop d3. But in the game, Dubov decides to take the pawn. I mean, I think this is a decision. I'm sure he had some kind of a file on this. He must have looked at it before. Rook c7, bishop a6. It's also possible to look at other moves. You know, it's a complicated position, and I'm sure Dubov will analyze this deeply before he gets into this again, but it's also possible to play a move like bishop e4. But he decides to play bishop a6. Hikaru plays bishop f5, and here Dubov did speak about this after the game, and it looks like the move e4 e4 would have been interesting, and I think that's what he was going to try if he got the same position another time. Because it does look like white might be able to claim a slight edge here. You know, you're still up a pawn, and eventually this pawn could come to d3 or d4, and black has to figure out a way to improve their position. If you play, for example, bishop c5, which looks like a good square, I think white can simply play d3. Oh, no, actually, no, d3, there's bishop takes f2. What did I look at here? It might be, I think here it was actually d4 with knight b5. So white has some chances here to get something. Maybe knight b5 is reasonable as well first. So, but Dubov played instead rook to a1, and now Hikaru does get a very stable position. So much so that here after f3, bishop e6, Dubov decided, probably rightly so, that he doesn't have much in this position. Played bishop b5, queen c8, bishop a6. And so the first game ended like this, in a draw by repetition. And, you know, of course, for Hikaru, this could be considered a success. The first game, you know, an easy draw with black. Dubov did mention after the game that he thought after queen a8, you know, avoiding the repetition, black would be slightly better. When you look at it with the computer, it says equal, which might mean that, you know, there's plenty of compensation for black. But it doesn't look too obvious, you know, what black's next few moves are going to be. Like, let's say white doesn't do anything incredibly threatening, but just, you know, puts their pieces on normal squares. I'm not sure what the plan is to really improve for black, you know, because it seems like if you push too hard, you might end up provoking white into being better. So I wouldn't really fault Hikaru for making a draw here. But Dubov said that he felt throughout the match, rightly or wrongly, we'll never know, but that Hikaru was so confident in his ability to win Armageddon that he was kind of okay with keeping the match even, put it that way. I don't know if that's, you know, it's hard to say from the play whether that's the case. Now in this game, Hikaru is white. Dubov repeats the Sicilian, and Hikaru repeats knight c3. He did also try to play c3 here, and he doesn't really want to test Dubov's preparation in bishop b5, which he probably assumed was really good from working with Magnus a lot. So Dubov repeats g6, which leads to the accelerated dragon. This position with knight c3, this variation is considered to be reasonable for black. It's not as theoretically threatening, I think, as the lines with c4. And so after bishop b3, Dubov repeats rook e8. Now, of course, Hikaru had time. Rook e8 is not the most common move, but it is a move that's been played by Gelfand, and as Dubov talks about in the interview that we did for Heritage Chess, Gelfand is someone that Dubov has worked with. So all of this kind of makes sense. It is kind of amazing how much information you can gather from looking not only at your opponent, but also the people that your opponent has worked with. And I'm sure Hikaru had done this. But here he comes up with knight takes e6. So yesterday he had played h3 here. And so today he comes up with knight takes e6, a move that's been played a little bit, but not too often. And after pawn takes, already he plays a new move, h3. Most games had gone with queen takes queen here. And with h3, he's a little bit more ambitious. He's saying keep queens if you want, but if you want to trade queens, black, you're going to have to waste a couple of tempo because I'm going to get my rook to the open file. So very reasonable move, h3, which is useful because it stops the knight from coming to g4, right? Normally, if white takes and then rook takes, white would be playing either f3 or h3 to stop that knight coming to g4. So Dubov plays queen c7, decides to keep the queens on, an interesting choice. And given that he was somewhat surprised, I think, by the opening choice of Hikaru, it is impressive that he decided to go for something very sharp. f4, b5. We'll see in the next game that Dubov faces this position, he deviates a little bit from this. And here Hikaru is still blitzing e5, b4. So b4 was an interesting move, the idea of which is to secure the d5 square for the knight. And with the little tactical point that on ef, we're attacking two pieces. So this position works out very well for black. So after b4, Hikaru blitzes out knight to a4. So he's probably still in preparation, knight d5. And he plays queen f3. And this is a positionally dangerous position for black because there's a chance that bishop gets sort of caught behind this phalanx of pawns. And there's also a chance that the c5 square will be weak. So it's a risky position for black. But Dubov plays knight takes e3. It makes sense to try to get the bishop pair at least. Queen takes a5. I did wonder whether, in hindsight, it looks like maybe rook d8, preventing white from castling, could have been, an interesting attempt. And then maybe white would castle kingside. But then there might be more chances to play something like f6 at some point. So it was interesting to play this way as well. But he plays a5, white castles long, and this position is dangerous for black positionally. You're on the verge of being in big trouble here. So Dubov plays queen a7, tries to trade the queens. It would be interesting to look at queen takes, actually, followed by simply knight c5. And, it looks like white might have chances to be better here. The knight is pretty strong on c5. And then, you probably just want to play something like h4, g3, try to bottle up this bishop. Maybe double the rooks, with rook d2, rook d1. Doesn't look like an easy position for black to play. But Hikaru keeps the queens, at least for now, plays queen to e4. Bishop f5, queen c4, queen e3, and bishop e6. So now Hikaru plays queen d4. So this is it's a bit of a mysterious sequence. Not too much has changed, right? Like the queens could have been traded on a7. Now they're being traded on d4. And it's unclear who this has really benefited. But Dubov makes an interesting choice here. He plays rook to d8. And this is a move where things can either go very right or very wrong. Because it's an open question whether Hikaru would have done better. Hikaru played rook to d1 here. But he did have a chance. And, I think most beginners actually would go for this. Rook takes d8 and say, I'm ruining your structure. And now it really looks like that bishop is stuck. of course, Hikaru and Dubov, both extremely strong, they had some idea here. The idea being that, it's hard for white to stop black from these plans with rook d2 or g5, and maybe they're active enough to get out. But it's still an open question. I know Peter Zvidler was not entirely sure here, and it still is not clear. One move that's interesting is to play h4, sort of saying, I'm going to stop g5 for now. And so that means black has to play h6 to play g5. And now you can try something like knight c5, let's say rook to d2, attacking this pawn. And then there's actually a nice finesse here. If you play g3, then rook g2 is a little bit annoying. But you can play rook g1 first and then g3. So only on g5 do you play g3. And I don't know. This looks suspicious. There's some tactical problems here. One threat is to play hg, knight e4 takes g5. That didn't work as well when the pawn was not defended, but here it is a threat. So I don't know. This position looks a little suspicious. So maybe that's what Hikaru should have tried. Hikaru played rook d1, rook takes, bishop c8, and now black keeps his pawn structure intact, which is a little bit different. And this is where Hikaru sort of started to lose the thread here. It looks like he could still play something like h4, a stable move, to kind of stop g5, and he would probably still be a little bit better. Instead, he plays knight b6, c5, and so black is trying to activate, and black is willing to potentially sacrifice a pawn here to activate their bishops. And Hikaru plays rook d2. That's a real mistake. It looks like rook c4, attacking the c pawn right away, and then bishop b7, g3. That would be a much improved version over what we're going to get in the game. And we're going to see what we get in the game here. But essentially, black doesn't really have better, I think, than either. Well, you can play rook d8 first, then white plays something like a3 to give the king some space. And, this pawn is falling, so black has to go for some counterplay like bishop g2, rook c5. Let's say take on a3, and then probably, take on h3, and then we take on a5. And if you compare this to what we get in the game, white is, far ahead of where they are in the actual game. It's not necessarily clear. It's still a complicated endgame, because the white pawns are not necessarily going to be that fast, but it's much better than the game. In the game, Hikaru played rook to d2, and after g5, suddenly these pawns are a bit of a problem. g3, this one falls, so it's already not entirely clear what he should do. It might have been time to bail and say, you know what, I'm not that much better here. Let me just play this way. And probably white is not going to lose this. Here you can play e6, and arguably white is not worse at all. I think white is not worse at all. So it might have been time to take the bishop and say, all right, let's move on. But Hikaru plays rook d5, still ambitious. Now after gf, rook c5, f3, nice move. Suddenly, he can't take on c8 because of f takes g2. And then after this, well, this pawn is probably more dangerous than whatever white has on the queen side. So, so the tables have turned. And Hikaru probably still had some better ways to play here, but he didn't quite adjust to the new reality. And here was really the last chance to kind of keep it together. He just played rook to a4 with the idea to play rook h4, but on bishop e5, really the best move was rook a5 to attack the pawn that way. And it seems like here white still has chances, even though black is probably better. But in the game, he plays rook e4. And by the way, if he played rook h4 here, then rook d1 is a real problem, threatening checkmate. And then let's say the bishop move, you play bishop f5. And now you're threatening rook a1 and rook b1. Actually, this is even better. You can play this and rook b1. Yeah, here, there's actually, I didn't see this at first, so it was my second variation. Now, the king doesn't have a good square because we actually escape, and we're going to win material here. So on here we have here, and the bishop comes to f2. Nice little variation. Yeah, so that was on rook h4. So Hikaru plays rook e4, but now black's just keeping their h pawn, and the bishop pair is very strong. The position's already gone beyond repair here. The next few moves are nice technique from Daniel, who, by the way, did not have much time, but he managed to play this part very well. The bishops are just too strong, and he wins the game here. So, again, black comes through with a win, and so that puts Daniel in the driver's seat. But now look what happens in the next game. Daniel repeats the c4. I think here he's not too worried about getting into that same variation because black really has no winning chances. It's more white that has a little edge in that line with the 4 knights. But not too surprisingly, Hikaru goes for something different. This f5 is a much more much less balanced positions. There's imbalances in the pawn structure. So it's a good practical choice. He plays d4, e4, knight g5, which is one of the ways to play. You can also play g3, and then e4. I think knight h4 is a line. And there's a crazy variation here, but I don't really remember all the theory here. But d4, e4, knight g5 is another line, and often the knight gets back to h3 and f4. And these are considered maybe to be slightly better for white, but black has plenty of play. Bishop b4 again is a sharp move that's not the most theoretical, so good opening choice by Hikaru here. Now Daniel plays d5, which is a pretty committal move. I saw that most of the games go with knight h3 here, knight f6, e3, and that seems to be a little bit more solid for white than what Dubov goes for. So I wonder if he was kind of, you don't want to play for a draw. Hello, Fuxia in the chat. You don't want to play for a draw when you feel like a draw is okay, because that tends to lead to the wrong thing. But I feel like he almost overcompensated here, played maybe over aggressively. So knight e5, queen b3, and this becomes just a very sharp opening with a lot of possibilities for both sides. And so he plays d6 here, which is an interesting choice. Of course, you can play either keeping the bishop, for example, like this. You can keep the bishop on this diagonal by coming to d2. There's a lot of different ways to play, or you could even play just e3. But d6 is a pawn sacrifice that is sort of typical. When the pawns are doubled like this, it's hard for that bishop to find a good square. And arguably, you can say that even if the pawn stays here forever, you're happy to be down that pawn, because these pawns are not really worth more than one. So it's an interesting way to approach the position. And even here, he doesn't mind this, because now his bishop is very active, and that pawn is what we call the backwards pawn. And with a rook on the d file, white is going to have plenty of play and control of the d5 square. It's a nice position. So of course Hikaru just castles, and he's just looking to give that pawn back. And so for quite a few moves here, they play a little dance of nobody wanting to keeping that tension of these two pawns, sort of surprising. And here, I think Daniel made a bit of an inaccuracy here. At least, it seems that way. He played knight takes d5, and surprisingly, black being able to give their bishop up like this helps them a lot, because that pawn on d5 does become a weakness now. And so if he played instead cd, which forces that bishop to make a decision, either stay on d7 or go to f7. But either way, I think here, for example, simply bishop g3 to keep the bishop. It seems like white's position is quite reasonable. You might be able to play for f3 and then play against the f5 pawn. At some point, you might be able to play knight f4, especially on knight e5. Then, of course, knight f4 will be played to come to e6. Doesn't look like a bad position for white. On the other hand, after knight takes d5, sort of surprising, but after bishop d5 cd, and now Hikaru makes a very nice move, queen to b6, suddenly that ending is actually not that great for white. Black has simple play of playing rook c8. They're always going to have some ideas of trying to take this pawn, and it's just not that easy. And things start to go wrong here for Daniel. We get to this. Actually, there was one moment here where this is hard. This is hard for a human, but the computer finds that this move, knight e5, bishop e5, de, is actually quite good for black. That position, the pawn structure becomes, you're essentially trying to play against this knight, and it looks like it is better for black. So that was interesting. In the game, Daniel actually does manage to sort of survive here with the move g4. So he's trying to make up for the weakness of the d5 pawn by creating weaknesses of his own on this side. So very natural g4, knight b6, bishop g3. But now Hikaru starts to play really well. Knight h4. So he's trying to come to f3. And Hikaru is sort of willing to mix things up here. He's playing fast. And he played this part very impressively. Daniel did have one chance to sort of keep things together here after knight d2. So, by the way, I think bishop takes f3, pawn takes f3 is not very good because that pawn on d5 is just too weak. We have to deal with g5. Sorry, my arrow went too far. Looks like it's going to be better for black. So he plays king g2, knight d2. So black is going after these pawns. On b4 you'll play knight c4, and he's trying to create something on the queen side. But white did have here a reasonable way of getting counterplay. Not so easy to find, but it's possible. And this was really the moment where I think things sort of turned around. White had the idea of knight e2, and the idea of this move is to play knight c3. And it's sort of, one way to find a move like this is to say, what is my worst placed piece? And in this case, the knight on f4 could really be better on c3 or b5. And here, you can't take on d5 because of bishop e6 check. And otherwise, white's playing knight to c3 and putting pressure. So let's say we take the pawn on b3, knight c3. And yeah, it's not easy here for black to play. I mean, there's a few ways, but if you play knight d2, then knight b5, and then this pawn falling is actually a bit of a problem, and suddenly the knights are not that great. So black seems to not have more than a draw here. But after bishop f5, Hikaru manages to take this pawn, and then he's able to push his queenside pawns very fast, and it's hard for white to get counterplay. And so the rest of the game was actually just very good technique by Hikaru, and there wasn't too much. This was a nice move, knight takes d5, with the idea that if knight takes knight, there's a2, and he queens. This was quite nice by Hikaru, the way he finished off black here. He forces the bishop to leave the square from which it defends a2, and yeah, after d5, it's just winning now because he's threatening to play a2, and there's just not enough for white. Game goes on a little bit, but the result is not really in doubt here. And Daniel resigned because he's not able to get even two pieces. He's going to lose another one after queen c3 check here. So amazingly, black wins another game. So it looks like black is better in this match. And so that takes us to game 4. And in game 4, Daniel seemed to say that Hikaru could have tried a little bit harder to win rather than be content with a draw. But of course, it's hard to know. They repeat the same opening, so they were both sort of faithful to their choices. And after rook e8, Daniel probably had a little bit of time here, a few minutes. I think there was 10 minutes between games. He had a little bit of time here to speak to his teammates, who must have found something a little bit better here. So he plays queen c7, f4, and remember in the other game he played b5 here. Now in this game he plays rook to d8, forces the queen to move, and now plays c5. And this was really interesting, and it's not something that the computer even finds like very quickly, but it's definitely an interesting way to play. He wants to play c4 and essentially trap this bishop, right? Like if we get to play c4, bishop a4, let's say white does like castles, then c4, bishop a4, and usually we can play something like a6. The idea is to play b5. That bishop, even if you don't play a6, the bishop on a4 is essentially trapped. So Hikaru plays e5, and now this is sort of the very nice point of this c5 move, is that he plays c4 anyway. And then the idea, which we see in the game, is that on ef, he simply takes it back, and then on bishop a4, he plays queen to a5, and that bishop is sort of trapped. So eventually black will be able to take the bishop. There's nothing really white can do to save the bishop. So one thing that was interesting was whether white, instead of taking on f6 as Hikaru did, maybe bishop a4 is an interesting attempt. But it does look to me like that bishop being stuck over there is a little dangerous. So we can play something like maybe knight h5. And then on g4, there's ideas like knight takes f4. And suddenly with the bishop, long-term trapped here, it seems like there's play for black. And I wonder also if there's another move like a knight e8, whether that could be okay as well. But another idea too is that on bishop a4, you can play queen a5 and try to transpose. And it looks similar, except that white may have extra options. Like white doesn't have to take on f6 right away. They could castle, and then, again, if the knight moves, it's not entirely clear. There is knight d5 here, which maybe is the most solid. But this is something to look at. It did feel like e takes f6 was a little bit, it made it a little too easy for black to escape. Here, after bishop a4, queen a5, already it can basically be concluded that white has nothing, because you're not going to be really better in this position, I don't think. Even though, sometimes in opposite colored bishops, you can say, all right, I'm going to get an attack on the dark squares. But here black is able to play f6, and then he's going to be pretty rock solid. They also, black also has a chance to bring their bishop on a nice diagonal here. So it doesn't look like really anything for white. Bishop f5. Probably not the only move to equalize, but a reasonable one. He's threatening to take on c2. He potentially wants to play queen e4. All the endgames are going to be drawn, like almost, even if there's a one more or less pawn here for either side, it's probably not enough to win. Queen e5, queen f6, and so f6 instead now allows queen takes e7, and the pawn hangs. It's probably still a draw also, but that's why Daniil is happy to play queen f6. And here, not too much for white to try, so he takes bishop f6, and now it's safe to say that this one will end peacefully. They eventually traded all the rooks, and opposite colored bishop endings with even pawns are almost always drawn unless there's some really egregious factor in a position, which there isn't here. They block it up and wrap it up. Meaning that we go to Armageddon. In Armageddon, Hikaru, because he had the #1 seed in the tournament, he gets to pick the color. And unlike most people, I would say, in this event, he has liked to pick black. I think because he feels like he's very solid, and he's also very fast. So the 1 minute less, for him doesn't feel that bad, because I think he feels like he can play faster than anybody. And he's right about that. That being said, in general, I feel like being white, in 5 minutes versus 4 minutes, being white is kind of better, because not that many of these blitz games end in a draw. And so if you think that, of these blitz games, usually, let's say you think 75 or 80% of games have a decisive result, then having that extra minute, plus having potentially, the white pieces as an advantage, no matter how you look at it, I would pick white, put it that way. But of course, I will never play against those guys, at least not anymore. So the Armageddon game starts with e4, and Hikaru plays e5. So Daniil decides to go e4. He doesn't go for the English. And clearly he came here with the idea of playing here, just getting a playable position, not looking really for an opening advantage, but maybe trying to get Hikaru out of his regular comfort zone, like not allowing him to play a Berlin where he knows the theory in and out. He just wanted to play chess. And surprisingly enough, this is fairly normal. But here, after king h2, Hikaru made a mistake, or at least a move that leads to a bigger mistake by playing d5. I'm not too sure if there's theory here, but I'm not sure that I love this h6 allowing king h2, and then white's going to play f4. So yeah, I mean, I'm not sure if I love the way that the black set up his pieces here, because it seems like they're letting white kind of get what they want. But yeah, and that's why, for example, after knight c3, just to go back a little bit, a lot of times black plays knight f6, and the idea is that it's not easy for white to get this set up, because you get to play d5. And so white, if they don't want d5 to be played, they have to play bishop c4, which is a whole other variation completely. And even here, white doesn't get an ideal setup because you chase the bishop around. So knight c6, allows white to play this setup. I don't think this is theoretically better for white, but it seems like, at least for a blitz game, it's a little bit easier for white to play. So here, after king h2, Hikaru plays d5, and d5 does allow a very typical, you've seen this in the King's Indian perhaps, this f4 plan. There's a line in the King's Indian, it's in the Gligorich system, I believe, where the line with bishop e2, bishop e3, where black plays f5, and there's this exact same idea that happens in the game here. White's already better here, and after ef, white is actually already much better because of this very counterintuitive move, bishop takes d5. And so we'll look just for a second. If instead of taking on f4, probably black should take on c3, b takes c3. This is still going to be an unpleasant position though, because here black has not gotten what they want. White has a very easy edge here. They have ideas like playing f5, f6. If you take on f4, knight takes f4 is going to be really strong. So it's just an unpleasant position. Probably the best is something like bishop d5. But again, these positions are not, this is not what you want to get. Here already you have to, maybe you lose a pawn, I don't know. With the idea d4, I don't know. So this is already not what black wanted to get. But after ef, bishop d5, the point is that after bishop takes d5, which is what happens in the game, knight takes f4, this bishop is really badly placed. And you can't play bishop e6 because of knight takes, pawn takes, and queen h5, and you take the bishop. So already this is real big trouble. In fact, it's just lost. The best chance for black was to take on g3, knight takes g3, bishop d5. But here, after, I think, queen h5, knight e7, knight takes d5. You can't take with the knight because the f7 checkmate. So you have to take with the queen. And then we do something like this. Here, rook f5. And black will lose a piece. But, they have more chances here than in the game, because you get at least a couple pawns. And you have some chances to fight here. You can play knight takes d3. And it's 2 pawns for a piece. Not enough, but it's still a game. In the game, after bishop takes d5, this is already game over. Knight takes f4, really, really strong. Knight e7. And now Dubov complicated his life a little bit. Played something that was absolutely beautiful. But he had a very simple here. Knight takes d5, knight takes d5, queen h5. And just wins a piece, basically. There's nothing that black can do to not lose a piece on the next move. Yeah, it's just because knight takes c3, there's queen f7 mate, so it just wins a piece. And on c6, there's queen f7 mate. So that would have been probably resigns already. He played queen h5, which is actually almost just as strong. Like the computer says, +5. However, in a blitz game like this, you kind of want to simplify your life. And knight e6, which is a beautiful idea. But after queen d6, he's actually not winning a piece per se. He's winning, he gets 2 pawns plus an attack and a crushing position, which is of course plenty good. But winning a free piece, would probably have forced immediate resignation. While here, of course, no one's going to resign. Dubov plays bishop f4, strong move. So he plays the rest of this game actually very well. And here he wins queen for rook and piece. But he also keeps an attack, rook f1. And the result was never really in doubt here. Of course, if this wasn't Armageddon Game, we wouldn't even talk about it. It would be resignation. But in Armageddon, there's always a chance for something to go wrong. But Dubov keeps everything under control. He's also up 2 pawns, right? So that actually makes a lot of difference because, for example, any idea like rook g5 just falls to queen d4. But I'll show you a few moves later. like in this position, for example, if black played rook g7, well, white is not at all threatened by this because the rook ending there up 2 pawns with a passed h-pawn would just be winning without even thinking, really. So because of that, there's really not much that black can try to do. So Hikaru tries to just keep pieces, probably just hoping that he doesn't get checkmated and can try to win on time. But here things just go south as white is making progress, as of course you would expect them to with this material. He takes yet another pawn. Now he's threatening to play rook e7 and win a rook. And so Hikaru makes a few moves. Again, it's just because it's Armageddon. But here, Dubov cleanly finishes rook takes c7 with queen c5 takes f8. And with this, Daniil Dubov takes the Lindores Abbey Rapid Challenge and the $45,000 prize. A big win for Daniil. He said probably the biggest win except for having won the World Rapid Championship. But yeah, really impressive performance. Especially in all of these knockout matches at the end. He played wonderfully. He also had like inspired openings, played all kinds of interesting things, sort of revitalized the line in the Philidor, managed to get decent results with it. He's very creative player and a well-deserving winner. So with that, I think that will conclude my after show and my coverage of the Lindores Abbey Rapid Challenge. It's been a lot of fun. Hopefully you've also enjoyed the Banter Blitz sessions that we've had. If you are a premium member, you got the chance to challenge everyone from Magnus Carlsen to Dubov to Ding Liren to Wesley So and so on. So those have been great. I believe we're going to continue to have all of these with the tournaments that we're going to be running in the future. We have another event starting in just a couple weeks, so not too much rest for the weary here. We are coming back with some high-level chess very, very soon. So yeah, on this note, thanks everybody for joining me for all these after shows. I appreciate the interaction and the feedback. And I will see you all very soon. Thanks again, and in the meantime, enjoy all the chess available online on Chess24. Take care.